G'day and welcome to Two Coaches and a Coffee. I'm Jason Webber and I'm here with Darren Burgess. Hang on, Burjo. Well, as much as I'm trying to make a joke, but Burjo's not here unfortunately. He's decided to leave me alone and fly off to the UK on another job. But I'm going to fly the flag solo today. And from that perspective, obviously I've got no one to argue with. What I thought I'd do is have a look at another podcast by a good friend of Burjo's, Dave Carolan, and a guy named Gary Wright. They do a podcast called Breaking Lines out of the UK, which does, funnily enough, almost the same thing that Burjo and I do. And it was awesome. I've had a good listen to it this week. Obviously, being the UK, they're very experienced in the EPL and football, the real football, the beautiful game. So those guys do their podcast based around that. But last week, they did a podcast around injury crisis. Is there an injury crisis? Now, that's very similar to the same subject matter that Darren and I have been talking about. So I thought I'd use some of their input to try and build a conversation, given I've got no one to talk to. But what it is really good about their podcast is, from our perspective, is that they're doing something very similar to us. So they're facing the same issues. They're both very pragmatic guys. They've got very realistic observations around what's going on in the league, the various leagues in the UK. And I think the fact that we're on the same tangent means that there are people in the same area trying to solve similar problems. And I think if you look at the evolution of the wheel was created probably across in multiple places at similar times. The fact that we're all thinking along the same lines means we're challenging the same ideas. We're having the same problems, okay, it means there's some trends there that we can work through. So let's start with that. One of the things Dave and Gary brought up was, has the game changed? And Burjo and I have talked about this. Now, I think you can do this and address it think about it from a number of perspectives. I think from the first point of view I'd like to talk about is the sports science perspective. Why are we asking the question? Sports science as a profession should be examining this consistently and being able to say, well, this is where the game's going. But it needs to be examined explicitly. It needs to be examined explicitly within the sports you work in and at the different levels, because I'm sure EPL, the Championship, AFL to VFL and WAFL in Australia would be very, very different. Same in the NFL in the States. NFL to college football is very, very different. So I think the sports science team need to be having a really, really good look at those patterns and understanding their evolutions over time and being able to be sure that they can communicate that to teams. Now, I've certainly always been of the opinion that we should be examining opposition as much as we can. I've just published I was on a team that published a paper recently looking at how to examine the different rates of work of other teams through the AFL, and we'll link that in the podcast. But the idea behind that, the motivation to do that, wasn't sort of duplicitously trying to undermine anybody, but to understand the patterns. Are we pursuing the right path? I mean, at the end of the day, you spend a whole big pre-season getting set up for what you think is going to happen. So understanding the patterns around the game, the evolution of the game, is really, really important. And does that game cycle across the course of the year? Is it faster in the early parts, colder, slower as the game gets colder and wetter during the winter months? In any case, are there changes? Well, in my experience, if I look at the rugby, the evolution of rugby union from, I did the World Cups in 2003 and 2007. If you look at the rate of the contact now, in particular, the impact from players both in the tackle and contesting the ball on the ground, it's gone through the roof. Right now, there have been changes to the way we condition for that. But we're still seeing problems. We're still seeing problems in Australian rugby around props with calf problems. We've had an Achilles problem in Australian Rugby Union. We've got props in the UK at the moment who are not coming on tour in the Southern Hemisphere winter because of calf issues. Genji, one of the big UK English props, will be unavailable through a calf tear. So we've got common problems, right? Is there something? The game has clearly changed. And I think I'll ask some more questions about how we're training in a little bit, but the game has definitely changed. From an AFL perspective, there's been massive changes in the last 15 15 years, certainly that I've been involved. We had the addition of rotations. Now, the addition of rotations was supposed to protect players from getting injuries by allowing them more time to come on and off, because they were unlimited. They're kind of like ice hockey back in the day, back in the sort of 2010 in that era. But the game sped up. The coaches took advantage of that and they played towards that thing. So the game got faster. Then there was a change in defensive strategies. Instead of us playing AFL game where people were almost like netball back in their zones, now they're pushing super hard. So when we get, we're almost like a forward press. So we're getting defensive structures moving right up into the defensive 50, increases the physical load on the entire game, particularly when teams get out and you've got to run back in defence. And more recently, we've had a reduction in rotation. So the game stayed the same time. We've got one or two more players, we're interchange players now, but you've got less rotation. So you've got to ask more of certain players. And when you look at the fundamentals of rotating people around, you've got to have X number of people on the ground. You have 18 people on the ground for the time of the game. So there's mathematically a limit to how many you can do, but it means some have got to run more or less. So there's been massive changes. There's no question about that. But if we consider that if the game has changed, the question I want to ask is, has our training changed to accommodate it? Now, I come from a strength and conditioning background. I've been there. I've tried to push the barrow. I mean, I started back in the late 1990s, so this grey beard is all quite real. And we always think, we're smart. And I think as a younger S&C coach, when I was a zealot, knew everything and all the answers, yeah, I think I did have all the answers. But I've got to ask the question now, have we changed enough to accommodate the game? The game is the game, okay? We know the time frame of the game on the weekend. We know when the games are going to be. They're not going to change. The things that change within that are going to be tactically how the coaches approach it. And what we have to ask ourselves is what we're doing through the week contributing to that possible injury crisis. Now, if you did nothing, that would equally be as bad, but somewhere there's got to be a sweet spot. And I feel at the moment, when we start talking about injury crisis, that we're probably missing it a little bit. Certainly know I was involved in some injury crisis back in the day in the AFL, and mostly that had to do with basic training, team training, going overboard for a period, right? And that exposing our athletes. Now, I had an old guy who used to work with in rugby league who would say, well, training's training. It's what the coaches want to do. Now, we have to adjust on the other side of that. So we have to do more or less in the gym or more or less of whatever else we're doing to accommodate for that. Are we doing enough? I don't think I specifically have the answers, but I think the point of this discussion is to, like when I'm with Burgos, hypothetically pose, well, what if we did less? We talk about the minimal effective dose. Well, are we in the right spot? Are we close enough to that minimal effective dose? Because if we're still getting these injury patterns and we're seeing it, Dave and Gary talked about it in Breaking Lines podcast. We're seeing it in AFL. Rugby league in Australia at the moment has got, someone emailed me the other day and said, hey, there's a hamstring crisis there. So the issue's there. The game, yes, we acknowledge that it's changed in different places, but have we changed enough on the outside? There's only so much work we can do to prevent an injury before we can also add too much work, and then we create injury by overloading the athlete. Something to closely consider. One of the things we don't consider, or I don't hear discussed as much, I know it's out there, is the concept of monotony. But monotony comes primarily from the triathlon world, the running world. We talk about the sameness of training. Now, I certainly saw this extensively in the AFL, where you get into that routine week by week by week, and it's almost the same thing every week. Now, what happens with that, and what I saw, was a period where we just started to overload training too much. And you're saying, hey, the coach, hey, we've just got to pull back a little bit. We're just going too far, up and up and up and up. And then you go, okay, we'll recover. Like the coach finally says, yep, we'll back off. But that overload creates a shadow. And now that we've got this training that's been really monotonous for a time, that monotony has a shadow effect. So you've deloaded training or you've started to reduce it, and you're getting injury hits, particularly the insidious onset. We see them in the AFL, the calf that comes off the field's fine, and 24, 48 hours later, it rears its head. So that idea of monotony and of the shadow effect of when you've peaked, it might take 3 or 4 weeks before that overload clears. I actually saw on LinkedIn today, someone, I don't recall who, had posted some great reports of all their monitoring data, and all their data's out there. And I'm looking at it going, it's just stating numbers. It's not telling us, like, yes, there's a mean and they did this much sprint, but it's not really conveying the impact of that overload and how long that lasts for. Because what we might need to be doing is really having a look at when we go overboard with speed in a game, because that's just the way the game went. There are changes in the total training amount for the following week. Now, I know there are people out there making those changes, not suggesting that no one's thinking like that, nor that I've got I've had a light bulb moment, suddenly this is solving it. But I think for younger coaches, and I guess this is what Darren and I know Dave and Gary tried to do, by talking about it, by speaking about it, it just gets those ideas out there. We live in a very complex world, and that complex world has so many things in it that sometimes we get focused on one area of our work and we let others go. So really have a look at your monotony of training and maybe ask yourself the question, have we changed training enough to match the changes that are occurring in the game? So again, in the Breaking Lines podcast, I think Gary brought up a great point. He talked about, are our players robust enough? That back in the day, in English football, guys were playing 40 games a year, they train all week, they play every minute of every game, tough as nails, without question. And I think we could say that of many sports. Now, it all harks back to, has the game changed? And I think there's unquestionably, yes, it has. It's faster. I think if you look at the UK, the boys in the Breaking Lines podcast talked about the changes in the surface, that, you go from a mud-sodden pitch to really nicely manicured. You've got higher technologies in drainage and all the like. The game is faster. The field is better. It can run faster. Boots have changed. The ball's changed. All those type of things. So has the game changed? Yeah. Do the players need to be more robust? Well, there's no question. There's 2 points that I'll probably bring up with regard to this. One is humans haven't evolved. We haven't changed. Since the last 100 years of sport, organised professional sport in the world, be it the beautiful game or whatever else, the human species hasn't evolved. So we can handle a certain amount. There's a level of tolerance to which our tissues can handle. So the question has to be, are we doing too much? If the game goes too far, and the point I made before was, the game's the game. Right? At the end of the day, I know there's, in Australia at the moment, the AFL coaches, there's some calling for a shortened game. Now, football in all its forms is a product, and that product has a TV audience and a paying audience, and that audience wants the product. Now, if you go and change that product too much, commercially there can be issues. So is the game going to change? I don't know. I kind of don't care. You're playing the game that as it's presented to you. So are we doing too much? Well, we have to. We're trying to play the game faster, play it at a better rate. But when we talked before about, training and are we doing too much to run, one of the questions I have is about monitoring. Now, we spend an inordinate amount of money and time on monitoring our athletes. GPS is front and center in that. That's telling us what we do. Everyone, no doubt, with the whole speed seek thing, that from my perspective, I'm adamant about how athletes run, and that the biomechanics is a piece of it. It's not everything, but it's a piece. So the question I have is, are we monitoring the right thing? Now, if I go back 10 years to when I started doing the research that led to SpeedSeek, my conclusion at that time was, hey, we've got these issues being soft tissue injuries, they're not going away. So what are we looking at? The signals we've got aren't quite right. Now, we've tried different things, and I've continued to evolve We have the evolution of innumerate things off the field in terms of force plates, eccentric, hamstring contractions and the like. Those things have all evolved, but we really haven't changed injury rates at all, right? Not one bit. Now, are they the right things? I'm not going to say they are or they aren't, but if we still keep having the injury issues, I think I've got to push it back to the sports scientists among us and those to question, are we looking at the right thing? Have we got the right signal? Now, it is a complicated issue, and I'll talk a bit more about this in a moment, but I think it comes down to the leadership in our groups, in our teams, being able to say, hey, we're not quite there yet, we haven't got it, and not to put all our eggs in that one basket. I spoke to an NBA team just a couple of nights ago from a speed sig perspective, and one of the things we talked about was the idea that they were saying, well, hey, we've got a bunch of projects going on, but once we get going, we really have no time. Now, I 100% get that, and I think if I got Dave Carroll and on this podcast, he would agree. Once you're going in a team sport, it's very hard to keep your eyes on anything else. But that's where I think it comes down to a crucial part of leadership within the team professional sports environment. And I get asked about this a lot. What's the difference between a high performance manager, as much as I hate that name, and just being an S&C coach? One of the leadership qualities is the idea to step back from the trees and see the forest. You've got to really have that Google mindset where the Googleites can have time allocated through the week to work on projects. As a leader, I think you need to step back and keep trying to look and understand what are the patterns we're seeing in the game, which we'll talk more about, but can we evaluate those? So that's one thing. The other observation that I would make about being robust is the last couple of years I've coached high school sport, predominantly AFL, but rugby and football, soccer as well, and just strength and conditioning for kids through this high school program. Now, one of the patterns I've seen just go absolutely rampant in the last 2 years is the prevalence of lumbar pars stress fractures, pars and interarticular stress fractures. Now, they weren't from lifting because guys weren't getting them in the gym, and certainly there were a lot of kids that were coming or referred to me because they had injuries outside, had nothing to do with the gym previously. So there was no question in my mind it wasn't stemming from what we're doing in there, but we're getting kids at young ages, 14, 15, 16, some of them going overboard in my opinion, personal opinion, but let's just say in general, they're doing more in a specific sport than they would normally have, or that a similar age kid may have done 15, 20 years ago. And is that contributing to this pattern, this beginning of injuries back when they're kids? Now, when you look at pars stress fractures, fundamentally it's excessive and multiple extension rotation, so it's an overload injury that occurs across time. It's a stress fracture. But you've got to look at when that occurs. Now, for most of these kids, cricket probably being the exception because of the bowling action, but for most of these kids, it occurs in running. So they are running, not only are they running in theory too much because you're getting the creation of a stress fracture, but they're clearly running in a manner in which their back is doing two things. They're trying to create extension to generate height, lift off the ground, and therefore flight phasing running. That generation of vertical force is not happening directly from the lower body. They're extending, in my opinion, into their spine to try and get more extension. But then they're also, when they land, when they make ground contact, instead of absorbing that force through the leg and into the pelvis structure, they seem to be copying it in the back. So when you look at, we talk about spring mass model in running, and I won't explain that too much here. It's very hard to do it verbally. But a spring mass model basically assumes the upper body to be fairly fixed and the leg to be both legs to be big springs. So as you land on the ground, the spring absorbs and then it pushes off again. But in reality, what we're seeing is these kids that have probably got a spring in their lower back that's doing too much spring in the lumbar spine and creating this extension rotation moment that's occurring as the athlete swings their arms, and they consequently try to go faster, which leads you back to, has the game changed? So it would appear to me that we're seeing younger kids trying to go faster with less ability and less capacity, it'd probably be a better word, and creating these injuries. And now I've seen these, I would have seen nearly 20 of these pars fractures in the last 2 years. Like, that's massive. So do we need to be more robust? That's the question. It still comes back to, are we doing too much? Have we gone too far? Right? Is the game become too much such that our training is overboard? There's an imbalance somewhere. Now, if I remember back to my childhood, there was no, we played multiple sports, but we never had kids out every other week with a back fracture or out for 6 months. One of the first kids I met at this school, who I met him in year 10, he'd had 3 pars fractures back to back to back to back. And it wasn't until I got there and we had a formulated plan and we slowed him down, we got him up and we identified this excessive back problem in his running. We're able to tidy that up, get him stronger, and hopefully he will be drafted into the AFL next year. So we had a good intervention there. But if that pattern exists elsewhere, if we're pushing our kids too far, how do they become robust if they're being stressed to the point of breaking when they're 14, 15? Not sure. But I think, again, it's one of those things we need to look at. From a pattern perspective, I talked about patterns a little bit more earlier. I think, again, I'll hark back to the boys on the Breaking the Lines podcast. They asked the question, what's the pattern? Is there a pattern between the game and the injuries? Well, I think there is. I think in computer science, there's always this idea that if you can physically see a pattern, that the computers should be able to detect it and we can work with it. I think it's there. But I think the patterns are more complicated than I think some people are giving them credit for. Particularly when we're looking at 1 or 2 variables and trying to associate that with an injury rate. It is far more complex. I was in a team that published a paper at the MIT Sloan Analytics Conference in Boston a bunch of years ago, looking at injury rates in a very, very tight group. So, I don't think it's plausible to extrapolate that too much further. But nonetheless, we were looking and trying to find the patterns, but we were using neural networks. We're using very complex computational techniques to bring a whole lot of information together. Now, I think I'll throw this back to the Sports Science Committee guys again. I'm very much of the opinion that sports science is not a badge. You shouldn't just put it on and go, hey, I'm the sports science guy, I do GPS. No, I think what a sports scientist should be doing is examining all these questions. Should be yes, you're doing the normal day-to-day data flow, but you've got to be looking for the patterns, looking for the exceptions, pushing so that we can start to feed the practitioners, feed the S&C coaches, the medical staff, to help them generate interventions that are going to make a change. Now, I see this pattern quite a lot at the moment. I'm seeing younger guys and girls getting into the sports science field. I'm seeing people coming in out of mathematics and science, more straight sciences, and being able to have a genuine impact. But I think from a person coming through your Bachelor of Sports Science and a Master's maybe of Sports Science, I can't go past the computational ability, your ability to manage data at volume, be able to start looking at these patterns and really contributing to the team more than just pushing data around and around in circles, trying to find patterns that can help practitioners make valuable change. So I think that's really something, if you're in that sports science market, I think you need to be starting to think about what you bring. I've said this over and over. If I was interviewing a sports science guy now, or girl, either or, I would be really pushing on what are your capabilities with data sets, with answering questions, to understand how can we find these patterns. If you go into business, in business, there are innumerable courses around the world looking at time series data from a finance perspective, from a business perspective, from projecting how much stock do we need, what price, what's selling, what's not. it's kind of the same thing, right? We're trying to keep our players on the field, but I think that higher level ability in computational science is super important. Okay, so that's a wrap for me for Two Coaches and a Coffee for this week. If you've got this far and you've listened to me the whole way, I really appreciate you getting on the podcast. We do value very much our couple of hundred people that are following us every week. We'd love to see more. So get it out, share it with your buddies where you can. Like we said, cross promotion. Go and check out Dave Carolyn's podcast, Breaking Lines. It's awesome. It's very similar to us, just a very different accent and probably a little bit different context, but nonetheless, an awesome podcast. So we look forward to next week having Darren back with us, and you guys have a good week.